Now, joining me from Durham University in the UK is Professor Anna Rowlands, a specialist in Catholic social thought and practice. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. The world has changed significantly since Pope Francis was elected back in 2013. Inequality now seems even more firmly entrenched. We're witnessing the polarisation of global politics, the rise of social media and so on. And yet, regardless, the pontiff remained committed to what he saw the very best of Catholic values, primarily justice for the poor. So I'm asking you, did he indeed leave his mark on the Catholic Church?
Yes, I think he undoubtedly did. And I think what's extraordinary is, and in a sense your question just frames that really well, is that he had this capacity to speak into this moment, to see the big sort of meta trends that we're living with in geopolitical terms. So he talked about the way in which we're living in this moment of polarization, where all of our crises that we're living with, ecological, migration, political and economic, are all interconnected. So he was able to name this in a way that was beautiful and clear to people so that they understood that. The guy you just interviewed in the square there was talking about the way in which he himself had absorbed that message. And yet he was also able to draw close to individuals, for people to feel that he was present to them. So somehow he managed that straddling of the naming of the signs of the times, if you like, and drawing people into a sense that they needed to feel in response to that, to be moved, as he talked about. Have you wept with those who suffer? Are you willing to be close to the site of human suffering? And yet he himself was also able to make that personal human connection that was so central to how he saw the ministry of Jesus in the world.
Yeah, others would argue, Professor Rowlands, that his papacy was one of contradictions, both for the Conservatives and the Progressives. He was resolutely against ordination of women priests and abortion rights, yet he seemed to open the door ever so slightly to LGBTQ plus individuals, but stopping short of embracing them fully. So, in your opinion, what were his biggest achievements and how did he overcome those contradictions, if indeed he did?
Yeah, so I think he himself would have said that those things were not necessarily contradictions. I think he held a strong doctrinal line. He didn't intend to change Catholic doctrine in its formal sense, but what he did want to do was humanize that doctrine and to draw people into a sense of the messiness and the complexity of real lives. He was unafraid of complexity, of conflict, of human fragility and weakness. And what he wanted to do was draw close to people and really to begin to listen more as a church to the realities of people's lives. So I think he felt that drawing close to people, whilst also holding a certain kind of doctrinal line, was not in any way a contradiction. I do think that you're right that meant that sometimes progressives felt disappointed that they wanted him to move forward with structural and doctrinal reform more quickly than he seemed willing to do. So he looked more conservative to them than perhaps they had initially thought he might be. Equally, Conservatives found him frustrating, particularly on liturgical questions, the Latin Mass, and they felt that he sort of mixed up doctrine in a way that appeared confusing to people because of his pastoral emphasis. I think both groups got him wrong in that regard, and I think there was an inherent consistency to the way in which he approached those questions. I think now he leaves a legacy for his successors in which he has opened up the church as a source of deep relevance and meaning, of prophetic value to people in the world again. And he has enabled people to feel in his constant mantra of tutti, 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 everyone, 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 that there was a home and a place for people in the church. That's raised expectations about what the church can be for people in the next pontificate. And I think the legacy will be very much now down to the cardinals. Will they pick up that widening of the tent of the church? Will they pick up that need to be a listening church in humility alongside accompanying humanity? And will they be able to speak with the same kind of inner freedom that I think Pope Francis felt that he could speak with on major geopolitical and social issues? Those are the open questions, I think.
And he certainly was the first papal leader to seek to address those sexual scandals that have plagued the Catholic Church for decades, wasn't he?
Well, I think that Pope Benedict would have thought that he was indeed doing that himself in some ways, but obviously the manner of his resignation and his sense of having failed to deal with the scale of that crisis was the very crisis that led to Pope Francis's election. So I think he felt that he was inheriting that as a major burden and responsibility for his time in office. And I think, again, that's been a kind of mixed legacy in the minds of many. I think he's acted in many ways in the right kind of ways on safeguarding issues, and yet there were abuse cases that he himself acknowledged that he got wrong. And I think, in fact, one of the areas in which he struggled most was perhaps cases that involved adult women being abused as opposed to children. And I think there's still a major journey for the way in which the Catholic Church understands the full dimensions of the abuse question. And again, that will fall into the responsibility box of the next Pope.
Just take us through what happens next and who's in charge at this critical time.
Well, there are people with various roles at the moment. We saw the responsibilities yesterday evening for announcing formally the cause of death of the Pope and going through the rituals of sealing the room and the transfer of the body and so forth. There are obviously responsibilities now for the funeral that we know will take place on Saturday, and then in turn for beginning to organise the conclave afterwards. So there are diverse responsibilities that sit on very different shoulders. But I think right now there's a sense of simply sort of gathering with expectation for those events on Saturday.
Let's just take a pause there, Professor Rowland, because obviously the big question now is who's going to replace Pope Francis at this critical moment. Is the Church going to opt for a more progressive candidate, or will a conservative person be chosen? And is this the time for the first Pope from Asia or Africa? Catherine Viette takes a look at some of the men who could become the next Pope.
Who will succeed Francis as the next head of the Catholic Church? A few names are already being mentioned. First, the Vatican Secretary of State, 70-year-old Pietro Parolin. He's an experienced diplomat and seen as a compromise candidate between progressives and conservatives. Another Italian, Matteo Maria Zuppi, the Archbishop of Bologna, is also a possibility. Like Francis, the 69-year-old cardinal is known for his social commitment to migrants and the poor and cares little about pomp and protocol. Outside Europe, there's Cardinal Sergio de Rocha from Brazil or Luis Antonio Tagle in the Philippines.
They will enter a conclave in a few weeks, men who come from Ulaanbaatar, Lesotho, East Timor, so truly from the four corners of the world with concerns that will not be those of the European heavyweights.
It's not just where the next pope comes from, but also what direction that pope takes the church. Could the keys be given to another progressive? Jean-Marc Aveline, the Archbishop of Marseille, shares the same views on immigration and church relations with other religions as Francis. On the other hand, the College of Cardinals could choose a more conservative-leaning pope like Robert Serra, shown on the left, or German Gerhard Müller. There's also politics at play.
We must not underestimate the influence of the Catholic Church's very large financial sources, which can come also from the United States, from Africa and elsewhere, and which want to refocus the Church. They want to get even with the Pope, who wanted to decentralize his Church and who wanted a Church that reflected the poorest and those who suffer.
Whoever is selected, the choice of the future pope will send a strong signal in a context of growing tension within the Church.
And watching that report with me is Professor Anna Rowlands, a specialist in Catholic social thought and practice at Durham University in the UK. Professor, obviously you've got a sense there of the potential front runners. Given that you're someone who's observed the Church for some time, who do you think will be the front runner?
I think we have no clue at the moment, and that's not just a sort of diplomatic answer. I genuinely believe that this is going to be a conclave of surprises. And again, your package there touches on some of the reasons for that. The Pope Francis, appointed a huge number, over 100 of the cardinals he will be voting in the next conclave. And he appointed not necessarily the obvious candidates in terms of the sort of historical legacy of the various episcopal roles that would have expected a cardinal's hat to come with them. Instead, he moved to non-obvious candidates, and he moved much more to the peripheries. He moved to people who he thought had something really distinctive to offer, I think, to the next conclave and to the governance of the church. And that also means that there are more Africans, there are more Asians, and there are those in really interesting growing mission contexts. The church is in a moment of real contradiction, where there is significant growth and conversions in some parts of the church, and there are others that are in forms of decline. Although, interestingly, even Europe sees in the most recent figures that there is a kind of small revival in some sections of the church in the global north, including in Europe. So the question will be, who can be a uniting person? Who can bridge those big intercultural differences to build a genuinely global Catholicism moving forwards? And I think this is a crucial part of what Pope Francis had in mind, that he himself wanted to decenter the church from a more Eurocentric focus. And he wanted a church that truly represented the vibrancy of global Catholicism. And that's tipping the church towards the global south. Now, whether that means we'll have a pope immediately as a successor from the global south, who knows? But I think certainly it would have to be a figure who could speak to and understood deeply the realities of the African, Asian, Latin American contexts, and who really wanted to take forward that vision of mission that was at the heart of Pope Francis' vision. One of the reasons he focused so much on the option for the poor, on migrants, on those who were in situations of economic deprivation, was really because he understood that this was the kind of missionary character of the church. It linked everything he did, from his first teachings, his very obvious public gestures, to the results of the synod on synodality from this last October, that the next pope will have to implement. So I think they're going to be really who can bridge those, who can build the connections, and who can really continue the process of listening, engaging with, and tilting the power of the Catholic Church in a way that recognises the reality of the vibrancy of the global south.
You mentioned there's some of the challenges facing his successor, but what are some of the other issues that this person is going to have to address? Because it is an almighty job, isn't it? Particularly in a world where, we've got issues regarding climate change, the rise of the far right, a lot of many young people being somewhat disillusioned with the establishment in failing to address these critical issues.
Yeah, so I think it will need to be somebody who can pick up that legacy with confidence on speaking on the major social issues of our times. And again, one of the things that Pope Francis did so brilliantly was show these interconnections, was show that everything is connected in terms of our current crises. And I think the ability of somebody to continue with that legacy with confidence and speaking with freedom on those issues will be really important. But you raised the question of young people, which I think is a really interesting one, because on the one hand, we can argue that there's a legacy of faith not being passed down to that generation, of Catholic disaffiliation, as it were, particularly in Europe and the global north. But in fact, recent figures in Europe show that there is actually a degree of growth of interest in the church amongst young people and in active church attendance, particularly interestingly amongst young men. And I think that raises really interesting questions for us. There's a generation of younger men perhaps being attracted partly through the vision of Francis, but partly for other reasons as well, I suspect, to the Catholic Church at the moment, but not so much amongst their female counterparts. So young men, but fewer young women. So I think there's a real challenge there for the Church, particularly in terms of the gendered dynamics of what we see amongst those young people who might be interested in or actively disinterested in Catholicism.
And that's very much my next question, because there is a global divide between young men and young women, and we're seeing that play out in politics as such. And obviously it depends on who indeed will inherit the job, but women's issues such as the issue of ordination of women priests and abortion rights, are still going to play a big factor, not forgetting that women do indeed make up 51% of the population.
Yes, and I think this is one of the areas where Pope Francis had room for improvement. He himself would accept that there were limitations to his papacy, but I think one of the areas in which he thought genuinely that he was making real progress was on the inclusion of women, particularly in governance roles within church structures. So he appointed more women to top roles in the Vatican than any previous pope, and he spoke endlessly about his desire for women to feel that they were full participants and members of the Catholic Church, and the respect that he felt for the role of women. However, he also tended to frame that theologically in a very particular way. He understood that there was almost a kind of strongly gendered difference in terms of the gifts that women and men brought into the life of the church and society. So he saw women more in terms of a kind of nurturing role, and they could be nurturing in governance roles, but he still saw that governance role in a more gendered way, in other words, layered with gendered meaning. And I think for some women that was quite off-putting, whereas for others it was perhaps more attractive, but certainly that was probably a polarizing way of thinking about the engagement of women. So I think the next pope inherits the question of theologically, not just in terms of administration and giving out jobs and roles, but theologically, what will the Catholic Church want to say about the relationships between women and men and about gender in the coming decade or so? And I think that will be critical, not only for the life of the church itself and really pushing forward that thinking, but also, as you've just pointed out, because the politics of gender are very much shaping our wider politics and social conversation at the moment. So that contribution will be critical.
Professor Rowlands, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you.